Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. This is a Monday Mini and the start of a new series, Behind the Seams. A look back at some of my favorite pieces from the archives. I sold hand-woven garments all through the 1980s in craft fairs throughout the Northeast of the U.S. Most of that work focused on various yarns of color and texture combined in a simple structure like plain weave, because keeping it simple was important to me when trying to price and ultimately sell my work. And then came the 1990s, a decade of tremendous challenge and change for me as I gave birth to two children, both of whom kept me on my toes. There wasn't the time or the money to really create a body of work, so I wove when I could. Many of the garments from that era have long been sold. I have good documentation of them, but I no longer have the actual garments to show or tell about. One of the things that was important to me during that challenging time was that when I sat down at the loom, I wanted to explore some of the things that I couldn't explore when I was churning out 30 yards at a time for craft fairs. I'd see things in magazines and think, wow, that is so cool. And I gave myself permission to try things that I had never spent time on when I was in production. One of the things that sparked my interest was an article from Weaver's Magazine, which ceased publishing many years ago, on shadow weave, a structure that plays on light and dark. This particular article is in issue 43, spring of 1999, an article by Nancy Rovin. Since I had an 8-shaft loom, and this draft was for 8 shafts, I set out looking through my stash of yarn to see what might do the job. I needed a dark and light, and I ended up picking this rayon aqua color yarn, a mill end from somewhere, and this camel brown color braided yarn that was acrylic and nylon. In a shadow weave, the same two yarns are repeated in the weft. I set up my loom, getting into the studio when I could. Everything in those days of young children was a challenge. Even back then, I wove yardage, which presumably would become clothing because that's what I do. But there was never, and still isn't, any plan as to what type or style of garment it will be. I figure out how to get as much yardage as I can out of the yarn in front of me, and that's what I'll end up weaving. So I had this roll of beautiful but subtle shadow weave yardage on my shelf for maybe a year, having completed it in the summer of 2001. I should mention that by this time I had started writing for Handwoven Magazine, having met the editor at the time, Madeline Vanderhoot, at the Cincinnati Convergence Conference in the summer of 2000. I had my first article ever published in December of 2000. Many of the articles that I'd write would be inspired by works that I had created or was in the middle of creating. And for all the years I wrote regularly for them, my work and my writings were intertwined. In February of 2002, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. I was young, with young school-age children. I really struggled to see where the future was in all of this. And I remember so clearly walking into my studio one day after yet another round of chemo and looking at all the accumulated stash of yarn and supplies on my shelves and thinking, what if I never lived to use all this? I think one of the greatest gifts that I got through my year of cancer treatment, the mastectomy, the rounds of chemo, was the loss of fear. There were many gifts that came out of that horrific year, but perspective was one of the best. What's the worst that could happen? I die? Well, I've stared that one down in the face, and obviously I lived, but it made me look at what was in my studio and on my shelves and think, There is nothing in here that can hurt me, and that I should never be afraid of creating something that is mediocre or average or even ugly. So what? Those years immediately following my cancer diagnosis represented some of the most creative years of my life to date. I set up my loom and I wove with abandon. I had no plans. I just wanted to experience all the things I had collected and make whatever I was inspired to make, challenging myself to use only what was on the shelf and see where life took me. I had been teaching on the road at the time and resumed that when I was through my treatment. And I have a vague recollection of creating a vest from my basic jacket pattern because so many people wanted to take my workshops but had already made the jacket. The vest became what is now my 500 vest. Construction of it was covered in a series of videos. Those links are all below. I have a vague memory of looking at that pattern with the square armhole and armhole bands and thinking, after pulling the shadow weave fabric off the shelf, what if I made it longer? How long could I make it with the fabric I have, about 5 yards, just over 20 inches wide? The weft face block patterning in this particular weave structure is tough to match in something this long, and I wasn't able to get a full back from this less than generous 20-inch wide fabric. So I thought to move the side seams around towards the back so I could get 3 lengths, 1 for the center back and 2 for the fronts with extended sides. So the length of the vest was basically determined by the fabric I had. I needed a lining, and I swear, this polyester length of beige fabric with this odd screen printed design just jumped out off the shelf and cried, "Use me, use me!" I have a fine arts degree, and one of the last textile related classes that I took was actually a graduate level class in surface design. We screen printed images, rotating the screen to create mirrored images onto the cloth. And this piece of polyester with acrylic paint was a holdover from the 1970s and was somehow still on my shelves. You can even see some of the registration pencil lines. It was exactly enough to create a lining for this vest. I had a small amount left of each of the yarns that I used in the warp and weft and decided that I would make an inkle woven warp face band for the trim. Using my shacked inkle loom, which will give me about 110 inches for one setup, I set it up twice with the remaining yarn from the fabric, adding in a raspberry rayon for some pop of color. One of the lengths that came off the inkle loom created 1 armhole and then started at the back neck, going almost to the lower edge of the garment. It wasn't quite long enough, so I fringed the bottoms and let the fringe hang over the band I cut from the regular shadow weave fabric. I needed some kind of closure and had little in the way of buttons and refused to go button shopping with kids in tow. One day I'll tell you about that experience. With a very small remaining length of yarns from the project, I made a braid with the lucette. I took apart a necklace I had picked up years before at a church bazaar and created a dangling thing from the single button I had in my stash. I repeated the dangling beads at the top of the vents and reinforced with a small triangle of ultra suede. And so that's the story behind one of my most beloved pieces. It came at a time in my life when I just created with abandon with whatever was on the shelf. And when Madeline from Handwoven Magazine asked me to write a feature for the issue on design, I used this vest as inspiration for an article on designing from the stash. Here is issue 11, September, October of 2002. And there's my article, Designing from the Stash. I'll end with this quote, directly from my article. The journey of creation, the evolution of a piece, is the gift, not the end result. Thanks for watching my Monday Mini. I'm Daryl Lancaster for the Weaver Sews.